afternoon, everyone, or morning if you were in Central Time. I'm in East Coast time these days. So thank you for joining us. We are super excited today to engage in this really thoughtful and I think impactful conversation with some students of color today. So my name is Lydia Smith. I am currently the Chief Diversity Officer of Victoria's Secret & Company, a long-time Wisconsin resident, just recently moved out of state, but still a part of the family. So thank you so much to the Madison 365 family for having me today. I'm going to very quickly introduce our great panel this morning, and then jump right into some questions. And we encourage all of you to use the chat to ask questions along the way. We'll be incorporating some of the questions from the group as well. So today what we're talking about is pushing the reset, really focusing about how students of color are reflecting, recentering, and pushing past a year of loss. We know that we have all been impacted on a tumultuous year from everything from social justice, racial equity and justice causes and initiatives, events that have happened over the past year, as well as COVID and just so much more that's happened. And so we want to talk about today, how are we responding and pushing past so that we're not just reacting, but also thriving. So jumping into introductions, first, I would like to introduce Angelica Euseary. She's originally from Detroit, Michigan. She's been in journalism for 10 years throughout high school, undergraduate, and postgraduate studies. She's currently a graduate student of Afro-American Studies at UW-Madison. Thank you, Angelica, for joining us. We know that you love talking with people and learning from their stories, so we're happy to learn from you today. And the next panelist that I want to introduce is Eleanor Falck. She's a senior at UW-Stout, where she's studying 3D environment art and is during an internship she had with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. She developed growing up Ojibwe. I can't pronounce it right. Sorry.
Ojibwe.
Ojibwe. Got it. Thank you. It's a game, an educational game designed to introduce Ojibwe history to culture and history and culture to youth. Super cool. And so we are super excited to have you and look forward to the thought-provoking discussion and questions coming from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, of course, we want to introduce Miles Sigh, who is a recent graduate from Marquette University. He's accepted a position as an account executive at iHeart Media. And his primary duty is to help businesses reach their goals by presenting and eventually pairing a specific iHeart Media resource to solve advertising problems. Miles is also the executive director and chief strategy officer for a nonprofit organization called Athletes Igniting Action. So super excited to have Miles as a part of this group as well today. Thank you so much for joining us. So we will jump right into questions. First, I will address this question to Angelica. Angelica, can you just talk about the repercussions of the past year with COVID? How did it really impact your ability to learn, to focus, and how did it impact your own identity and sense of self?
Yeah, so the pandemic started during my first year of graduate school at UW, which was very rocky because graduate school was hard. So having to transition online was challenging. And then dealing with like family stuff. So I had to go back to Detroit and be there just to be closer with my family and stuff. So it just shifted everything. I'm not like the best virtual learner. So not being around my friends and peers was hard. And then it just made me just look inward to do my work because I didn't have that that community like I had. Like we couldn't hang out with each other. So it just really had me thinking about like what it is I wanted to do. So to distract myself in a healthy way, I was looking into PhD programs, just to find something else to do instead of worrying about health and all the other stress that came with that. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that one. It was challenging for sure.
Absolutely. Totally can relate. As you think about some of the challenges that you experienced, what are some of the things, can you give an example of something that you did, to push past that or the way that you adapted and you see, looking at maybe this back part of 2021, what's different in terms of how you adapted compared to, early spring of 2020?
Yeah, I definitely had to learn some boundaries with school and work and everything, just because with going to class virtual, I was like, okay, well, since I'm already here and doing work, I can just go to class, which is 2.5 hours, and then do more work for another like 3 or 4 hours, and just was really burnt out. So I had to put up some boundaries with that and be like, okay, I'm not working past 5. I'm not working on Saturdays, because there's always something to do, like with everything. So I had to learn to put up some real boundaries for sanity.
Agreed. That's a word and a lesson for us all. Miles and Eleanor, any additions or anything else you would add to that in terms of, the overall repercussions or kind of how that impacted your own identity and sense of self?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I definitely agree with putting up boundaries was something that I had to learn, but I feel like especially as an artist with like a lot of big long-term projects that I've been working on, I've really had to buckle down and start making a schedule for myself because with COVID, you can sit at like your computer all day. I didn't have to like go in person to class anymore. And so scheduling became a big part of my life and something that I'm proud of now that I've put in the work to really manage my time to stay on top of things. And also for my own personal health, scheduling is important. So I'm actually very proud of how I've been able to come out of like online classes more on top of time management.
It's great insight.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add was just, kind of be, piggybacking off of what these two ladies said is, just the isolation from people was really tough, at first. It still is to a certain extent, but, when the pandemic hit, I actually was going into my senior year of college, and I was so ready to finally kind of not let loose, but have a little bit of the burden that you have on your during your first 3 years of undergrad kind of lifted to a certain extent. And so not being able to enjoy my senior year with some of my senior classmates was a bit of a bummer. But it was something that we had to push through and something that was difficult at the time, but you eventually got used to it and were able to manage anyways. But I think that, it was a tough time for everybody. So understanding that everyone was going through the same things and we're in some degree in the same boat as you was a comforting thought. But yeah, that was something that I was definitely struggling with at first as well.
You know what, Miles, I think you bring up a good point. There's probably an assumption out there that your generation is adaptable. You are able to pivot and, especially thinking about this generation being really digital natives. There's probably this assumption that you would adapt, you would blend, you would figure everything out, and you would be good with this whole virtual learning situation. And I think you and Angelica both pointed out there were some challenges with that. What are some of those things that you think that people didn't think about, they ignored as it relates to your generation in particular, with dealing with the challenges from COVID? Yeah,
that's a great question, Lydia. I appreciate that. And I think it's really interesting because, when you have a generation like ours that is, so digital oriented and quote unquote adaptable, people assume that when anything is thrown at us, that we're just supposed to be able to handle it, right? We're just supposed to go with the wind and go with the motion, right? So there's a lot of dangerous assumptions that come with that notion. And I think one of them is something that Angelica touched on earlier, was actually that a lot of students have a hard time learning online, right? And so for me personally, I can, agree with that sentiment, is that it was very hard for me to learn online. I loved being in the classroom and having that face-to-face time with my teachers and face-to-face time with my peers. And that was obviously something that I was missing out on, learning virtually. I think also, a lot of students didn't have the means to learn online. And I think that's something that people didn't even take into account as well. And so, having a mother who worked for the Milwaukee Public School District for almost 10 years, I saw that firsthand with a lot of students in the Milwaukee Public School District. And so you had countless students that actually school stopped for them when the pandemic hit, right? They didn't have the means to be working online or, have a personal computer where they can interact with their peers and teachers and things of that nature. So when they went home, on, March 11th and March 12th, whatever, that was the end of school for them. And so a lot of people didn't even think about that. And so to help people kind of understand that, for the most part, a lot of students were seeing the same effects, but there also were some students that were experiencing something completely different. And so, like I said, again, those are some of the dangerous assumptions that came with, the idea that this generation is supposed to adapt to whatever's thrown at them.
Such good points. Eleanor, anything else that you'd like to add in terms of those assumptions that you've seen?
Yeah, I definitely also struggled with the connection to peers being lost, especially as someone who's going to school to learn how to be a game artist. One of the big things that I do at school is have a semester-long class where I make a game with a team. And so one of our teams was structured fully online. We never saw each other. And I think there was a lot of problems with not ever connecting with each other as people, not really having that time to just have fun together and bond as a team, which I think is very important. So that was a struggle. And also just in art and design classes that I've had, we really missed out on the opportunity to just walk around, see everyone, look at what they were working on, and really bond on a human level. And so I think it created some animosity when we would do critiques. People would feel more attacked than they would if they had seen that person face to face. And that was something that I wasn't expecting. And just that human connection really felt missed.
So true. So true. It's so important, especially I love how you pointed out to your particular area of learning. We didn't necessarily take into account that it's not a one size fits all approach. If we're in different fields with different focuses, that human interaction becomes so much more important. So that's such a good point to make. Angelica, I'm curious too, thinking about some of these assumptions that we didn't necessarily take into consideration. How did any of those assumptions, did you see them maybe disproportionately impact students of color? Or did you see, an impact or a difference in how, some of these assumptions we were making about how things would work or, some of those repercussions impact students of color?
Yeah, I think to echo what Miles was saying about the lack of access to school in Black communities, being in Detroit at the beginning of the pandemic, watching DPS struggle to get computers and internet services to Black kids. My mom is a teacher and teaches at a neighborhood school, and she taught first grade at the time. And just watching her do that, you can't even control 6-year-olds in person. So watching her try to control them and teach them online. So that was a hill she had to get over. And just like he was saying, school stopped for some people. My little sister graduated last year and had a really hard time, navigating high school online. It was just weird. They couldn't homecoming, they couldn't prom, all those things that they just missed out on. So I think people had different experiences that we don't really think about.
Thank you. We want to welcome Juliana Bennett to the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. Juliana is a rising senior at UW, studying finance and political science. So thank you so much. We know that it's important for you to also represent BIPOC students, young people, and particularly people of historically marginalized backgrounds. So we are excited to have you as a part of the conversation today. So we are going to jump right in, Juliana, and ask you a question, kind of engaging. We've been talking about some of the assumptions that were made in terms of how young people would be able to quickly adapt and react to COVID and to, the digital sense, online learning, hybrid virtual environments. Can you talk about some of the things that you've seen in ways that, whether it's health advocates, campus communities, parents, or anyone else that's kind of an advocate or an ally for young people, some of the things that they've been able to do to address this past year of isolation for students of color?
Yeah, and also thank you for having me. Hi. Yeah. Well, I guess I just want to kind of like echo that how some of these assumptions that we're young and we'll figure it out pretty easily. We'll always, we know we can handle it easier. Is just, I think to some extent, like young people are adaptable. However, moving to an online landscape within like the matter of like only a couple weeks was really tough on everyone, especially trying to learn in this new arena, learning this how it even works and how to deal with it. And there were certainly disparities between like Black and brown people, and being able to adjust just because of access to internet, access to computers, access to Wi-Fi, and things of that nature that many students of color don't have that privilege of having, and ultimately affecting our learning experience. I mean, I definitely have I know some classmates that were struggling with having to go home and knowing that they don't they have to, one, take care of their own family members while at home. And then on top of that, like barely have like a decent enough computer to do their online work. So it's a situation where I think that we didn't really think that all the way through when moving into an online landscape. And ultimately it does take a mental health toll on us, not just, I mean, on top of like just having to transition to this like within a matter of weeks, but then also having to deal with the ongoing effects of like not even being able to perform to your full extent because you don't have the resources necessary in order to do so.
That is so, so true. You bring up a great point that I want us to kind of pivot and talk about a little bit, because you brought up mental health and the mental health aspect of all of this. We'll jump to Eleanor. Eleanor, can you speak to, how you've seen your peers or you yourself have dealt with some of the pressure from a mental health perspective of dealing with schoolwork and everyday responsibilities in this environment, this post-COVID environment, and how do issues like anxiety, depression, interfere with all of that?
Yeah. So personally, I am neurotypical, but I have many friends who do suffer from like anxiety and depression, and it has 100% been affecting them, especially during COVID. I find that for me, schedules are very important to like maintaining normalcy, being like something that's predictable throughout my day. And I find that some of my friends who do struggle with mental illness, they also find that schedules are very useful for them. And so when that's gone, it becomes difficult for everyone to make their own schedule, make their own new normal. But if you're struggling with mental health, that becomes even like vastly more difficult for you. And so that's one way I've seen the pandemic affecting people with things like anxiety and depression.
Thank you for sharing, Eleanor. That's a great suggestion with the schedules. Angelica, Miles, Juliana, anything else that you all would like to add on just the topic of mental health and how that's impacted work, school, everyday life for students?
Yeah, I would say just the worry of health, like worrying about getting sick, worrying about your family members being sick. Like I was self-testing myself for COVID, like smelling, taste, trying to just crazy stuff, like, just insane stuff. Because I was worried. And going back to campus now, like the beginning of the semester was like a whirlwind, and well, the last 2 semesters were like whirlwinds, trying to figure out like, oh, how do I stay safe around people? Like how do we navigate this space? So just like the real worry of like health, and staying healthy for sure.
Absolutely. Miles, I thought I saw you unmute.
No, I am totally in agreement with Angelica. I mean, just the anxiety that came with, keeping yourself healthy. And I'm someone that gets colds very often. And so I remember around the time that COVID was kind of coming on the scene, I would have a slight cough and I'd be like, oh my God, here it is. I have COVID. Just the stress that I put myself through, wanting to keep myself healthy was not great. But yeah, I can definitely, agree wholeheartedly with what Angelica just mentioned.
Yeah, it's amazing the extra stress that we put on ourselves, right? And then we're operating through the world with all this, kind of stress and baggage that we're holding on to. What can, whether it's faculty or it's just the community in general, what are some things that you think that we can do to be more supportive of students, both as it relates to the mental health aspect, but just in terms of this transition and dealing with all of the pressure, so much that is going on, over the last year and a half? And Miles, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the ways is just to continue to create safe spaces for students, where they feel like they're welcome, feel like they belong. And that's, a huge piece of, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that inclusion piece is, one of the things that I feel like doesn't get enough attention, making sure that the students feel like they can bring their whole selves to school. I mean, we talk so many times about, with me now being in a professional setting in my work, and, talk so much about bringing your whole self to work. Okay, well, students should be able to bring their whole selves to school as well. You know what I'm saying? So that's something that I think is important. And something else is just representation. Representation matters. Seeing someone, if I'm in the classroom, seeing someone and looking across and seeing a teacher that looks like Miles Sigh, that's important to me, because more times than not, they're gonna understand the lived experiences that I've gone through, because they might even share some of those lived experiences. So those would be 2 things that I think are vital to how we can make sure that students are able to continue to be their best selves and continue to progress as we're continually working through an ongoing pandemic.
It's such a great point. Those are like taglines that we hear in corporate America so often, and we don't think about the fact that they apply to the education world as well. Great point, Miles. Anyone else have ideas and ways that, whether we're talking about faculty or our communities in general, that we can be more supportive of students in their needs as it relates to dealing with COVID, mental health and such?
Well, maybe not more supportive, but like current supporting structures that we have. I like really love UHS and, have been going there since freshman year. And they've always been pretty helpful. It would be nice if there were more like mental health providers for BIPOC folks. Which
can you tell everyone what UHS is?
UHS, University Health Services. And then they also have like on a mental health clinic within UHS. So although like UHS is lacking in resources for mental health providers for BIPOC people, I know like the waiting lists are like super long, and it's really tough to get a provider, let alone someone that can like relate directly to your experiences. But on the other hand, I've really found value in their group work. They have several groups specific to BIPOC people to, discuss the mental health issues that we've had, the traumas that we've experienced as BIPOC people. And it's super therapeutic, and then I highly recommend it.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your transparency and sharing. I think that is so empowering. Any other ideas? Oh, Eleanor.
Yeah, I think in general for teachers, but also people who are maybe like in leadership positions in a business, something that could be done is just to create a space for like your students or your employees to connect with one another. Because oftentimes, like, I just go to class, I sit down, and then there's like a lecture in some of my classes that aren't art focused, and that like you get the learning done, but you don't really get a connection with your peers. And so I think like something, even when we were online, one of my professors would do, we would all like get on our like Zoom meeting or Teams meeting, and he'd like have a whiteboard up, and we could just all like doodle and write little things. He'd like give a prompt, and so we'd just all be like doodling on this whiteboard for 5 minutes at the start of class while people were showing up. And even something small like that really created like a lot of memories with the class, and made us maybe understand each other more, be able to share our personalities more and connect with one another. And so I really appreciated things like that, where I could do more than just learn in class. I could also still connect with my peers, and that was really important.
That's a great idea. Thank you. That sounds fun. I wish I would have been in that. I'm going to start doing that in my meetings at work. People are going to look at me a little bit crazy, but it's okay. Angelica, any just ideas or suggestions in terms of how we can just be more supportive of students?
Yeah, I think this is going to echo what people have already said, but people have different experiences. Like, my feelings of isolation in higher ed did not start at the pandemic. Like, I was in a class of 50 people, the only Black woman, one of 3 Black people. So I'm like trying to go back to campus and going back to being to literally feeling like the minority. That's hard for me. I don't want to do that. I'd rather stay at my house with my friends because I'm comfortable there. So I'm just asking like faculty members, like people with power, to have some empathy and to understand that like for folks like me, it's even harder to go back to this uncomfortable space. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That is such a great point. You actually kind of jumped into one of my follow-up questions, and I think it's that, how are you all coping now? You know, even as we're making this transition, there's stress and anxiety tied to now returning back to the way that things were, and there might be new anxieties and new stressors. So speak a little bit, you know, Angelica, while we have you, speak a little bit about what some of those new feelings are and how you're dealing with them now.
Yeah. The new feelings are pretty much just like the worry of like what's gonna happen. Cause like that change of like go in the house, wear a mask, things are different now. I prefer if that didn't happen again, but we never know. And just worrying about my health and like feeling weird in class. Like I don't know what my classmates look like. I know like from here on up. And just trying to adjust to that and not feeling so weird. Because it's weird, like being in class and like not really seeing the people you're talking to. So you can't really see their full face and their full self. So that's what I'm adjusting with, like trying to I feel like I'm being forced to go back to normal when it's not like 100% safe. It doesn't feel safe because we still have to wear masks, but it just feels like it's just happening and I need to go with it or I will get lost. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is very real, and I'm sure that many students are feeling that way. Any other thoughts about, you know, as we're transitioning and you're back in classes at some level, what are some of the new stresses or worries and concerns that you all have now and how you're, you know, dealing with them?
Yeah, I think I have a kind of unique perspective from being someone who wants a job in the game industry. Something that has been happening due to the pandemic is that companies are starting to realize, like, I can hire like anyone in the world pretty much because they can just work for me remotely, which has its pros and cons. It allows job flexibility. You can like live anywhere you want, potentially, but also it makes getting a job in the game industry like even more competitive than it already was. It's extremely competitive. And so now, as I'm like finishing my senior year, getting my portfolio ready to apply for jobs, I'm very much feeling the stress and all the pressure of knowing that I'm like competing against the whole world for my dream job. And that can be very stressful.
That is such authentic perspective. And I think that's something that a lot of us that are in our careers probably aren't thinking about every day. So thank you for sharing that, Eleanor. That's really important for us to consider. Any other thoughts?
I just want to echo also what Angelica was saying, because I super relate to the feeling of being forced to go back to normal when it's not normal. And I'm like, I honestly like have beef with just having to go back into person classes. There was like no options to have any like sort of hybrid or like anything like that. And I'll be honest, like I just got over a cold and that I had like, you know, for a couple of weeks, and I was super annoyed that I was sick. And I was like, anyways, I think like a large portion of the student body has like the same common cold that's going around. But it just like adds another layer of stress. And honestly, I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but because of COVID, I feel like in just being quarantined for so long, I feel like I developed this sort of like social anxiety of being in large groups of people. So it just adds a whole other stress factor. But I'll be honest, I feel like I do perform better in person than online.
That's so insightful, though. I think what I'm hearing you say too is like there's pros and cons. There's things that you might be happy or excited about. There's things that you're worried about, and you're put in this position to try to deal with all of that at the same time. You know, you're mentally trying to handle all of those feelings, all of those emotions, and still perform and still go to class and still get good grades and everything else. Miles, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, just real quick, I'll add this briefly. I don't want to beat a dead horse because we've had a lot of very good points here. But I think, you know, just to the point of kind of almost being forced to go back. I'm actually in a hybrid model right now with work, but something that I think that completely ignores is people's comfortability level when it comes to, you know, the pandemic. I mean, some people are absolutely, you know, fine going in person and, you know, not wearing a mask or whatever that might be. And obviously your comfort level depends on you, and that's perfectly fine. But you can't assume that everyone is on the same level. And I think that that's, you know, not necessarily fair to the people that are coming in and out of your building. And then also when it comes to stress too, I think just the stress of the unknown, right? So we're in an ongoing pandemic. We've seen that there's variants to this virus, and we don't know what's next, right? I mean, so we want to tell people that normal is on the horizon, but we don't know, right? We really don't, and I think that in and of itself, you know, adds to the anxiety and stress that we face every day.
So true, and insightful. Miles, one of the things I'd love to have you start with, something that is top of mind for me too, is Eleanor brought up work, and you've talked about, you know, your current job and the role in hybrid. How is everything that is going on and everything that has happened over the past year, how is it also impacting how you are assessing employers? So I know, Eleanor, like you spoke about the point of how employers are assessing talent, but how is it impacting what you all are looking at and the things that you're considering as you're looking at employers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, two things I want to touch on here. One, you know, assessing how people are handling the pandemic, you know, whether it be a hybrid model, if they're, you know, letting people work completely remote still, if you even have the option. And so, you know, that's one thing. And there's a lot of industries that need people, you know, in a specific building to get the job done. But if you're a type of industry that has seen that there can still be, you know, productivity from home, then I guess from my perspective, I don't necessarily understand completely the rush to get people, you know, back in the building. From a certain extent, I do get it though, because, you know, when people are in the building from a management level, you can actually put eyes on people and kind of track that productivity a little bit better. So I guess I do understand from that point, but so that would be one thing. And then also, you know, something that we haven't necessarily touched on all that much in our discussion today has been, you know, how during an ongoing health crisis, we saw, you know, a Black man killed literally in front of our eyes. And that was, you know, something that we were supposed to, you know, in some cases kind of sweep under the rug, right? And so that was very tough. And so, you know, when I look at employers, I look at, there's been so much talk about, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion this last year and a half. And while talking about it is great, but there has to be something that comes next, right? There has to be action items that have been put in place to actually turn the things that you said into, you know, real actionable goals and items that you're working towards. And so that's something that, you know, when I look at an employer, I want to know exactly what you're doing, what you've said, and how it's being implemented. You know, as a young professional, that's something that's important to me. And so those are two of the things that I really take note of in light of this, you know, pandemic and also social pandemic that we're going through as well.
Great point. I think, and we can come back to it, but I think it's equally important that, you know, faculty, staff, colleges and universities are doing the same as it relates to the social justice aspect too. So that's a great point, Miles. Thank you for bringing that up. Other thoughts about, what you're assessing as you're looking at employers now from the group? Anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I have something. I think that my change in perspective on companies that I'd like to work for is partly because of COVID. I used to want, like, as a freshman and sophomore, I used to really want to work for like the biggest game company out there. I really wanted that name and like the fame. But I think as I've been growing throughout the pandemic, I've started to realize that like the name of the company isn't really the most important thing to me. What I really want out of a company is a project that I enjoy working on and a team that I enjoy working with. And part of what that would be was a team that values me, that I trust, and that we're just kind of, I don't know, everyone's passionate, everyone meshes really well. And I find that for me now, that would be way more important than just working at like some really famous big company.
That's so insightful. I wonder if some of that too might have to do with just, we've talked a lot about connection. And so having gone through this year of not having those connections and then trying to rebuild and reestablish the connections, to your point, like that's really important to you now, having that team aspect, and what does that look like? Any other thoughts about assessing employers? So one other follow-up similar to assessing employees, have you experienced changes in the classroom? So any changes as it relates to grading, upgrading, or alternative forms of assessments, any alternatives that you've experienced as it relates to, this transition from learning environments over the past year? I'll just open that one up to anybody.
So the last academic school year, I was a teaching assistant for an Intro to African American Studies course. And it was really interesting seeing how students were so stressed during the pandemic and trying to do school. Unfortunately, a lot of my students were getting sick because they were in the dorms. So email me, I can't get the paper in, I'm trying to type it. Can I have an extension? And just that, I felt terrible because you should not have to beg me for some grace when you are fighting for your life right now. And I think academics and just everyone needs to implement that, just some grace, some empathy, some understanding, because it was, as a student, I felt bad for my students. And just as an educator, I was just like, okay, well, if you're sick, don't come to class. You on Zoom trying to be here, you can't really speak. You need to be in the bed. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That's so real. It is interesting now, some of the standards are different. So before, if you were sick, you wouldn't go to class, but since it's Zoom and you're at home, you're sick, coughing, doing whatever else, and you're still trying to be in class on Zoom. That's an aha moment for people. I think that's really insightful.
Yeah, I guess piggybacking on that, I've really appreciated the grace that most faculty members and TAs have given us. Pre-COVID, if anyone got a cold, I think people would just power through lecture. But now knowing, after COVID, if you got a cold, you should stay home. And that's something that I hope that we can take with us, that if you're feeling physically or mentally ill, that day, you should stay home. You should feel safe enough to ask for extensions. On the flip hand side of that, I do know that post-COVID, it's been tough for international students as well. I have a friend that during COVID went back home to Thailand, and just the time difference, that's a whole other thing to grapple with. And I know, so in this situation, her professor was not being lenient with their final schedule, and she would have to take her final at like 4 a.m. Ultimately, with getting like the dean and students involved, that was rectified, but it shouldn't have to get to that level. It should just be like, if you have to take your, if you, knowing that if you have a time difference, or even if you're just feeling ill, like to have some leniencies with deadlines that should be extended to your academic sphere, and also really to the work environment in general. Because I would hope an employer would have those same standards.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts or ideas just around the changes to classrooms and grading or assessments that you all have seen or experienced? Okay, so we are at the 10-minute mark. I just want to make that announcement to the audience in case you all have questions. Feel free to add those to the chat. Juliana, while I have you on the screen front and center, I want to circle back to one of the topics that you brought up earlier that I thought was so impactful, and thank you for your transparency and vulnerability. But you talked about, the university health services and knowing and understanding that access to people who can help and people who have perspective and background, and able to relate to BIPOC students is so important. Can you also talk about, though, what are some of the common barriers to even seeking treatment as we think about this population and students? What are some of the and how do we deal with, I guess, some of those barriers in getting students to even go to seek the treatment in the first place?
Yeah, well, I guess I can speak to a bit of my experience, and please someone stop me if I'm wrong. But growing up, I think it's pretty similar in a lot of Black and Brown communities that like you shouldn't seek mental health, like just deal with it, you'll figure it out. And like that was never really talked about in my family life, just like the issue of like mental health and healing from trauma. And I think that does serve as like a barrier to BIPOC students with even going out and seeking like mental health care. And then, on top of that, knowing like, I know maybe we have services with UHS, but I know it's going to like take forever even to get appointment. And then I like having to deal with those emotions that you've been taught for your entire life to just bottle up, serves as like significant barriers to students to even seeking care in the first place. And I think it's something that we should try to like change within our community of just like, it's okay to feel not okay. And it's okay to deal with your trauma and ask for support. And I've found that like UHS has been extremely professional in in offering help with that. So, and not only like just listening to your concerns, but teaching you like coping mechanisms to deal with trauma. So
thank you for sharing that. I think that is so helpful. I know sometimes it can, be a little uncomfortable sharing your own personal story, but that is super helpful and so empowering to so many. So thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts from the group about, kind of removing some of the stigmas or those barriers that exist for students to seek the help that they need as it relates to mental health?
Yeah, I'll jump in here briefly. I really appreciate. I'll start by saying I really appreciate you, Juliana, for saying what you said, because you grow up, and I'll speak to my experience as a Black man. Mental health was not something that was discussed, and then also just as a man, the idea that you're supposed to be tough and strong and can't let anybody see you cry and things of that nature all adds its own pressure on top of that stigma of mental health. But some other barriers that I can think of, in terms of why students might not seek out the treatment that they might need would be, one, a language barrier. I mean, that's huge, especially in some of our brown communities, Black and brown communities that might be Spanish speakers or, speak another language, even people that are deaf. If we have, American Sign Language, that might be another barrier for someone. And then also want to bring to the table, the LGBTQIA community. There might not be professionals that are on campus that are equipped with the knowledge to deal with an individual like that, and so that also could very well be another barrier. And then outside of just students, geographical locations is another thing that's huge. I mean, when you talk about Black and brown communities, especially, I'm from Milwaukee, and growing up on the north side of Milwaukee, where it is primarily Black residents. I mean, the closest hospital or closest medical facility was probably, 10, 15 minutes away in the suburbs. So that's another, issue on top of what I've already mentioned and what Juliana mentioned, when it comes to barriers to seeking the treatment that you might need.
Oh, great points, Miles. Thank you. So we have one last question from the audience before we hit our final question of the panel. But I think this is a great question from the audience. How do you all suggest we have better generational conversations about mental health, not just with adults, but with young adults and kids? One of the things that was brought up is that, you all haven't had those conversations historically. So how do you suggest we go about bridging from a generational standpoint so that we can move forward with talking about these types of things? I'll leave that one for anyone to start.
I think we can start talking to younger students of color, specifically Black kids, about mental health by eliminating or erasing the shame that comes with feeling weak mentally. And then just us not falling into the respectability politics, trying not to appease anyone or look a certain way or be a certain way or whatever. Just having real conversations with kids about how they're feeling, because kids know how they feel and kids will tell you how they feel better than most adults will. So just making sure that they understand there's nothing to be ashamed of, because when you get a cold, you go to the doctor. When you break a bone, you go to the doctor. When you can't see, you go to the doctor. If something is wrong or going on upstairs, or you feel some type of way emotionally, it's okay for you to get that help. It's necessary. So
necessary. I love that. And I think that one of the things you brought up that is so important is removing the shame. And we do that by sharing our own stories, telling our own stories, being examples. The way that you all have been so vulnerable and transparent in this conversation, doing that with young people is what opens the door for them to feel empowered to do the same. So thank you all. I just wanted to add that in there. Eleanor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Miles had touched on some stereotypes about people of color, specifically Black men being not allowed to share their feelings. And I wanted to connect that to Indigenous people as well. I think there's a stereotype that we're all really stoic and don't talk about emotions. For some reason, that's a stereotype. And so I think for kids just in general, breaking down stereotypes about gender and race and allowing everyone to be vulnerable is very important. And I think also some education for people who are educators or people who are around children about different cultures, different gender norms is very useful, because I find in my culture there is very much a focus on community healing and talking to your community members, and so but that also needs to be coupled with seeing like a licensed therapist as well, depending on the situation. You can't really like just do one form of healing, like heal yourself in one way. You really need to heal yourself like all around, have all of these different support systems working together to really make sure that you are mentally healthy. And so I think just, yeah, education for people who are around children and knowing how like all of those different support systems that they could have access to is important.
I love that. Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Miles.
Yeah, something I'll add real quick is I kind of want to marry two ideas that that Eleanor and Angelica both mentioned briefly. You know, we talk so much about, you know, trauma as it relates to mental health, but something that Eleanor just mentioned was, you know, talking about healing in communities of color. And, you know, we talk about how this trauma can be generational. Healing can be generational as well. And I think that that's something that we don't discuss enough. And, when we talk about the generational healing, it can start with this generation. And I think that's the most powerful, you know, thing that comes to my mind when I think about, healing and trauma and how those two are interconnected. And, you know, one of the things that Angelica mentioned that I really loved was just talking to younger people and opening up that safe space for people to talk about how they feel, talk about things like race, you know, religion, gender, things of that nature, because those are so important. And I actually want to touch on my first experience going to a therapy session. It was actually a group therapy session with, I think there's about 10 other young men from different communities of color. And we literally just talked. We just had an open discussion, and we had a licensed therapist there, but she would ask an open-ended question, and we literally would just talk. And it was like she wasn't even there. And that was so therapeutic for me. And that was something I didn't even understand that I really needed at the time. And so, again, going back to Angelica's point, that's so necessary. And it's a great way to kind of open up the floodgates, you know, to that generational healing.
Yeah, we were giving you snaps. That was so good. I love that. That is huge for all of us. I think it's the answer to that question from what can we do? It is to have the conversations, to start to heal ourselves. And then, you know, that translates to the younger generation. So we are right at time. I want to give you all the opportunity, 30 seconds to hit on two things. What did you learn to let go of this past year that you feel like has helped you to heal or helped you to take that next step forward for your future? And, you know, just what did you learn? What has this taught you about you? Miles, you're front and center, so we will start with you and then hit all the ladies in the gang.
Sure. Yeah, I would say first and foremost, in terms of learning what to let go, I think it sounds really simple when I say it, but it was something that was tough for me. Was learning to let go of things I can't control. And I think that that's so important, because if there's one thing that the pandemic taught us is that, you know, you can have all the plans in the world, but they can quickly change, right? And I mean, I remember like it was yesterday, I had an event planned in New York for a conference that I was supposed to go to. And it was literally the weekend that I ended up not going back to school because of the pandemic. So one thing would be letting go of the things that you can't control, but also celebrating the small wins. You know, especially as young professionals, we have all this pressure that's put on our shoulders as to, okay, so you're done with school now, so what's next? Or, you know, where are you going to be 5 years down the line? Where are you going to be 10 years down the line? And while it's very important to have goals, I think that's, you know, a very important piece of growth. Celebrating the small wins is just as important as well.
Such good advice. All right, Eleanor.
Yeah, I think this past year, I let go of maybe a lot of ego of being like, I'm going to make it to like the biggest company, or like, I'm going to be the best. I don't think that that is as important or really should be important necessarily. I think it's good to value your own health and happiness rather than just like what everyone thinks of you. Like, wow, she works somewhere cool. I want people to be like, wow, she's really happy and enjoys what she does. I think that that's way more important. And something I learned was that there are a lot of communities out there that want to help you. As like being online more during COVID, I found a lot of like Discord communities for game artists with like loads of people who just like want to see your work, want to critique you, want to help you get better, and also just want to support you and be your friend. And so I've really been engaging more online with mentors and friends and trying to also be a mentor myself now that I feel like I've grown a lot, and I'm really grateful for that.
Wow, so insightful. You all are like getting me all worked up. This is great advice. Angelica, you are next.
I let go of overworking myself. It was very hard to do. It was very hard to do. I'm a type A planner. I have a plan for it all. And with being at home, like I was saying, like I would get done with class and it's like, oh, well, I'm just sitting here. So I can go do something and look up. It's 10 o'clock. I have something to do the next morning and I'm tired. So making time to relax, making time to just like be. We live in a capitalist society, so everything is always working, but I'm done overworking myself. Like, no more.
What else to you, girl? I love it. And last but not least, Juliana, I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, all of you had good answers. I guess mine would be similar to Eleanor's, that letting go of kind of like the idea or pathway that is society creates for you, and just really honing into yourself and what you want. In the business school, it's like kind of like a culture where you have to have an internship every single summer, and you have to be ready to go into a Fortune 500 company. And then once you get into that company, you'll be there for like a few years. You're going to be there for 20 years, and then you become partner, and then your whole life is done and it's already planned for you. And the pandemic really forced me to take a step back and realize that's not what I want. And that's not the pathway that I'd like. And really, and it allowed me to like just take time for myself and learn what I would like to do. And in doing so, get on a pathway that I like really enjoy. So yeah, just letting go of like expectations of what you want to be and really honing into like who you are.
That's such great advice. I for one will say thank you all for the advice. I was taking notes and writing stuff down, and you all are wise beyond your years. So thank you so much for your time, for your vulnerability and transparency in this conversation. I am sure so many of us took away so many great things from the conversation. So thank you all. And thank you to all of our guests who joined us and those of you who stayed on after to hear the end of a great conversation today.
This is 365 Media.